The power went out at 6:40 in the evening. Not a flicker. Not one of those blinks where the microwave clock resets and everybody laughs about it. The real thing. The kind where the hum you never notice stops, and the silence that replaces it feels wrong. The refrigerator went quiet first. Then the router blinked out, and the little green light on the modem died, and the house, a good house, a warm house, a house full of things, suddenly had nothing to say. There was food in that refrigerator. $80, maybe $90 of it. It would last a few hours. After that, it would start becoming garbage, quietly, shelf by shelf. There were candles somewhere. In a drawer. Possibly the drawer in the hallway, or the one under the sink, or the box in the garage that never got unpacked. Nobody was sure. And when they were finally found, half of them were decorative. Vanilla scented. Wrapped in cellophane. Candles meant to be looked at, not used. There were no matches. There was a lighter with no fuel. There was a flashlight with corroded batteries, and there was a phone at 19%, and there was a debit card that would not work at the gas station on the corner because the card reader was as dark as everything else. And here is the part that stays with you. Nobody in that house had done anything wrong. They worked. They paid their bills. They bought what they were told to buy. They had a smart thermostat and a subscription for razors and an app that would bring dinner to the door in 22 minutes. They were not lazy and they were not foolish. They were modern. That was all. But the house had no answers of its own. Now go back. 90 years, more or less. A different kitchen. A wooden table with a scar down the middle where somebody's grandfather cut something he shouldn't have. It is dark outside, and the wind is doing what wind does in November. The lights in that house are out too. Nobody panics. A woman crosses the kitchen without hurrying because she knows exactly where the lamp is. It is where it always is. She lifts the glass chimney, touches a match to the wick, and the room comes back, not brightly, but enough. Enough to see faces. Enough to work. The matches came from a tin on the high shelf because a wet match is worth nothing, and she learned that from her own mother. There is no refrigerator to worry about because the food that needed cold is in the cellar, and the cellar is cold on its own, the way the ground has always been cold. Supper is already half made. It would have been made anyway. The stove burns wood, and wood does not care about the electric company. The children do their schoolwork at the table, in that yellow circle of light, and they will remember it for 60 years as one of the nicer evenings of their childhood, though nobody planned it that way. That house was poor. Let us be honest about it, because the honesty is the whole point. That family had less money than the modern family in the dark. Less comfort. Less certainty. Less of almost everything you could count. But when the world outside stopped working, that house kept working. Not because they were tougher. Not because hardship built character, or any of the comfortable things people say about other people's suffering. That family was tired. They were frightened more often than they let the children see. There were nights when the arithmetic on that scarred table did not come out right no matter how many times the pencil went over it. They kept working because the house was built not with lumber, but with objects. 20 of them, more or less, scattered across shelves and drawers and hooks and corners. Ordinary things. Things you would throw away without thinking. A tin of buttons. A coil of wire. A ball of string. Empty jars. A drawer of scrap cloth. A bucket. A bar of soap worn down to a sliver, saved anyway. None of it looked like a system. It looked like clutter. It looked like the habits of people who could not let go of anything, and that is exactly what their grandchildren called it, later, when they cleaned out the house after the funeral and filled 3 bags with what looked to them like junk. It was not junk. It was a plan. Every piece of it answered a specific question, and the question was always the same one. What happens if something goes wrong today and no help is coming? Because something always did go wrong. The coat tore. The chair broke. The lights went out. The money ran out on Wednesday when payday was Friday. The child outgrew the shoes before the shoes wore out, which was somehow worse. And a Depression-era house answered those questions from inside itself. That is what this is about. Not old things. Not nostalgia. Not a museum tour of the American kitchen. 20 objects that lived in ordinary homes 90 years ago. 20 things a modern house genuinely does not need until, for one long cold evening, It needs every single one of them. If your mother saved buttons in a coffee can, if your father had a drawer of wire and screws that fit nothing you owned, if your grandmother rinsed a jar instead of throwing it away and you never once asked her why, you already have most of this list. You just never saw it whole. You're about to. They were poor. They were not helpless. And by the end of this, you may find yourself walking through your own house differently, opening a drawer you have not opened in years, and understanding, finally, completely, what your family was actually doing. Let us start where the trouble starts. With the light. 1. The oil lamp. It sat on a shelf near the stove, or on the mantel, or on top of the icebox, but wherever it sat in the same place every single day of the year. That was not tidiness. That was engineering. A lamp you have to look for is a lamp you do not have. It was not beautiful. The glass chimney was smoked gray at the top no matter how often it was cleaned. The brass was dull. The wick was trimmed flat with a pair of scissors kept for exactly that purpose, because a wick cut crooked burns crooked and smokes up the room and eats the oil faster, and oil cost money. A woman in 1935 could light that lamp in the dark without touching anything else on the shelf. She had done it 1,000 times. Her hand knew the distance. And when the room came back, that low, honey-colored light that never reached the corners, the house did not become bright. It became possible. You could see a face across the table. You could see the potatoes. You could see the needle. Nobody in that kitchen said the word emergency because nothing had happened. The lamp was not an emergency object. It was a Tuesday object. It came out when the sun went down, and the fact that it also worked when everything else failed was not a feature anyone thought to mention. That is the whole difference, and we are only one item in. A modern house has emergency light. Somewhere. It has a flashlight in a junk drawer with batteries that leaked green crust across the contacts sometime around the last presidential election. It has scented candles that were bought as decoration and will produce, over 4 hours, a room that smells like a bakery and is still mostly dark. It has a phone with a flashlight app that eats the battery you will want later for the one call that matters. The old lamp did not fail, because the old lamp was never asleep. It worked every night. Something you use every day cannot betray you. 2. The tin of matches. Here is where you start to understand what kind of people these were. Matches were cheap. Cheap enough that, even in the worst years, a family could keep them. And yet matches were treated in a Depression-era home with a seriousness that would look almost comical today, because a wet match is not a cheap match. A wet match is nothing at all. So they lived in a tin. High on a shelf, away from the steam of the stove and the damp that came up through the floor in spring. Sometimes an old coffee tin. Sometimes a tobacco tin with a hinged lid that closed with a small, satisfying click that half the children in America would recognize instantly if they heard it again tonight. And they were never all in one place. There was the tin in the kitchen, and there were a few in a jar in the cellar, and there was a small bundle wrapped in waxed paper in the drawer with the string, because a fire in the kitchen that reaches one shelf should not be able to take everything. Think about what that means. Nobody wrote that plan down. Nobody called it redundancy. A mother simply understood, in her hands and not in her head, that the ability to make fire was the ability to cook, and to boil water, and to warm a room. And that a family that loses the ability to make fire in January is a family with a very serious problem and no telephone number to call about it. She was not frightened. She was not stockpiling. She was doing what people do when they know that nobody is coming. There is a particular dignity in that, and it is difficult to explain to a world that has never once wondered whether it could start a fire. 3. The stove that did not need permission. Wood, coal, kerosene. It depended on where you lived and what was near you and what you could afford that year, and plenty of families changed from one to the other as the money changed. But the principle was identical, and the principle is the point. The heart of the house burned something that sat in the yard, or in the bin by the back door, or in a can under the porch. Something you could see. Something you could count. Something that did not travel through a wire from a place you had never been, controlled by people whose names you did not know. That stove cooked breakfast. It heated the water for the wash. It dried mittens. It kept the kitchen warm enough that in the coldest weeks the whole family simply lived in that one room, and slept in it too, some nights. And there is an entire generation of Americans who remember their grandmother's kitchen as the only warm place in the world and cannot say why the memory makes their throat tight. The stove worked in the morning. It worked at night. It worked during the storm, and the day after the storm, and the week the mill closed, and the winter the father did not have a job to go to. It asked nothing of the world outside. And feeding it was somebody's chore, usually a child's, which meant that every kid in that house grew up with the knowledge, absorbed and never taught, that heat comes from work, and that if nobody does the work, the house gets cold. That is a strange thing to have learned by the age of 8. It stays. 4. The cellar. Not a room. A machine. Go down 4 steps below the ground and the temperature stops arguing with the weather. It sits there, cool and steady, in July and in January, because the earth is enormous and patient and does not care what the sky is doing. Depression-era families put that fact to work without ever calling it science. Potatoes in the dark, in a slatted bin, where they would not sprout. Apples wrapped so one going soft could not spoil its neighbors. Onions hung. Milk and butter down there in warm months. Squash on a board. Carrots in sand. Whatever came out of the garden or came home cheap at the end of a market day, put where the ground would keep it. The shelf along the far wall held glass, and we will come to the glass. Come down those steps in your memory, if you can, and notice the smell. Every American over 60 who ever visited a grandparent's house knows that smell exactly. Cold stone, dust, apples, dampness, and something faintly like coal. It is one of the most powerful smells in the country, and almost nobody has smelled it in 40 years. Here is what that cellar actually was. It was a refrigerator that no one had to pay for. It was cold storage that could not be switched off, could not fail, could not be shut down by a fallen tree 11 miles away. When the wind took the wires down in that town, and it did, regularly, the food in the cellar did not notice. The family did not lose $80 of groceries. The family did not lose anything at all, because the family had never handed the safekeeping of its food to something that could stop. That is the end of the first group, and I want you to notice what they have in common, because it is not what you would guess. Not one of those 4 things was bought for the day everything went wrong. The lamp burned every evening. The matches lit every fire. The stove cooked every meal. The cellar held food every single day of the year. They were not backups. They were the primary system, and because the primary system did not depend on anything outside the property line, the family never had to change plans when the world outside did. Modern homes have backups. Depression-era homes had independence. Those are different things, and the difference only reveals itself on the one night a year when it matters. But light and heat were the easy part. Because a house can be warm and lit and still have a mother standing in the kitchen at 8 in the evening, doing arithmetic she has already done twice, trying to make Wednesday reach Friday. And this is where the story stops being charming. 5. The pantry shelf. You have seen 100 photographs of a full pantry, and they lie a little. Most of them were not full. Picture it honestly. Look up at it from a child's height. For shelves, painted whatever color was left over. Flour. Beans dry, in a sack folded down at the top. Potatoes. Oats. Salt. Sugar if there was sugar. Coffee, guarded like currency, sometimes stretched with chicory when it had to be. It is not a rich shelf. In February, you can see the wood at the back of it. But it is not empty, and the distance between nearly empty and empty is the widest distance in the world. Here is what almost nobody tells you about that shelf. Its purpose was not abundance. Its purpose was time. A mother looking at that shelf was not counting cans. She was counting days. Flour, beans, potatoes, oats, those 4 things, bought cheap, bought in bulk when the money allowed, kept dry, kept mouse-proof. Those 4 things meant that if the paycheck did not come, or came smaller than promised, or did not come again the week after, the family would still eat. Not well. Not happily. But they would eat, and they would eat food they knew how to cook, and a child would not go to school hungry and have to explain it. That shelf bought a family 2 or 3 weeks of time. And time is the only thing that has ever solved a money problem. The store was not the answer, because the store required money, and the money was the problem. Everyone understood this. Nobody had to say it out loud. A pantry was not a hobby, and it was not a virtue. It was the difference between a bad month and a catastrophe, and every woman standing at that shelf knew precisely which one she was looking at. 6. The glass jars. Now we come to the object I would ask you to look at hardest, because this is the one your grandchildren threw away. Empty jars. Rinsed. Dried. Turned upside down on a cloth. Stacked on the cellar shelf, and in the cupboard, and on the back porch, and in a wooden crate under the stairs. Not a collection. An inventory. Watch a child in 1936 carry an empty jar across a kitchen with 2 hands, the way you carry something that matters. Nobody told that child the jar was valuable. The child simply noticed that a jar is never, ever thrown out, and children learn what a family values by watching what a family refuses to lose. Because that jar had a future, and the future was not decided yet. It could hold the beans that would go up in summer. It could hold nails, buttons, screws, seeds, coffee, lard, sugar, or the small change from a jar of coins that was supposed to be the shoes fund. It could hold a candle in a draft. It could be a drinking glass, and in a great many American homes it simply was the drinking glass, for years, without embarrassment. 1 object. 6 jobs. And it cost nothing, because it arrived in the house carrying something else. That is not thrift. That is design. A modern kitchen buys containers. Matched sets, in the correct size, in a color chosen to look calm. And they are lovely, and they cost $30 or $40, and they do exactly one thing each. A Depression-era kitchen did not buy containers. Containers arrived on their own, and the house simply refused to let them leave. 7. The flour sack. And what the jar was to storage, the flour sack was to cloth. 50 pounds of flour came home wrapped in fabric. Not paper. Fabric, real, usable cotton, and every woman in America knew it before the mills did. So the sacks were unpicked at the seams, carefully, so the cloth came away whole. They were washed until the printing faded off. And then they became whatever the house needed most that season, and the list of what a house needs is longer than people remember. Dish towels. Curtains for the back window. Pillowcases. A child's underclothes. Aprons. A nightgown. A dress. The mills noticed. Before long the sacks came printed with flowers and checks and small quiet patterns, because the companies understood that a woman choosing between 2 brands of flour would choose the one whose sack she could make a dress out of. Sit with that a moment. There was a stretch of American history in which the packaging of a staple food was designed to be worn by children. Not as charity. Not as a program. As commerce, because the manufacturers knew exactly what those kitchens were doing with the bag. And here is the part that has quietly broken hearts for 90 years. Some of those children knew. They knew the pattern of their dress was the pattern of the flour their mother bought, and some of them were ashamed at school and never told her, and some of them were proud because their mother had chosen the prettiest one at the store on purpose, and had counted on that choice for weeks. Both children were loved exactly the same amount. The dress was the proof. Nothing in a modern house arrives able to become something else. Everything arrives already finished, already disposable, already on its way to the curb. The packaging is not a resource. It is a problem the family pays to have taken away. 8. The grease tin. We will not linger here, because you already know this one, and it deserves more respect than a lecture. A tin near the stove. Fat saved from cooking, strained, kept. It fried tomorrow's potatoes and greased tomorrow's pan and made pie crust and cornbread and, in a hard year, made a piece of bread into supper. But notice what it really was, the only ingredient in that kitchen that regenerated itself. Everything else on the pantry shelf went down and never came back up until money appeared. The tin filled itself slowly from meals already eaten. That is why it lived next to the stove and not in the back of a cupboard. It was not a leftover. It was working capital. 9. The canning shelf. And in the cellar, that far wall. Jars in rows, and every row was a month. Tomatoes, beans, corn, peaches, pickles, whatever the garden or the orchard or the neighbor's overflow had given up in August. But the canning shelf was not really about food, and if you have ever stood in front of one, you already sense this. Look at the labor. A hot August kitchen with the stove roaring at 90 degrees outdoors. Bushels on the table. Hands scalded. A woman working past midnight in a room she cannot cool, canning food that nobody in that house will eat for 4 months. Why would anyone do that? Because she was speaking to her future self. She was standing in August and putting supper on the table in January. She was taking a season of abundance she could not eat and refusing to let it evaporate, converting it into the one thing the family could not buy, certainty about February. Every jar on that shelf was a promise made by a tired woman to her own children, months before they knew they would need it. And when the shelf emptied out toward spring, she watched it empty and counted it, and the year the shelf ran out in March instead of May, she knew before anyone else did what kind of spring it was going to be. We have finished 9 objects. Light, fire, heat, cold, food, glass, cloth, fat, time. And every one of them exists to answer the same question from a different direction. What does this family do when the world outside stops cooperating? They did not stockpile. They did not fear. They did not think of themselves as prepared, and if you had used that word on them, they would not have understood it, and might have been insulted, because prepared implies you expected trouble, and they did not expect trouble. They lived in it. But something has been sitting quietly under this whole list, and it is time to say it plainly. Every object so far has helped the house get through the day. The next 5 kept the house from falling apart entirely, and they lived in a drawer that your mother had, and your grandmother had, and that you can probably still see if you close your eyes. 10. The toolbox. It was usually metal, and it was usually dented, and it usually sat under a bench in a shed or on the floor of a closet where it caught everyone's shin in the dark. Inside, a hammer with a handle worn smooth in one particular place, because one particular hand had held it for 30 years. A saw. 2 screwdrivers. Pliers. A file. A can of assorted screws that were never sorted and never needed to be, because the man who owned them could put his fingers in and come out with the right one. Nothing in that box matched. Half of it was inherited. Some of it he had made himself. Now understand what that box actually meant in a year when a man could not find work. A chair breaks. The rung comes loose and the whole thing rocks, and it is only a matter of weeks before somebody sits down hard and it goes. In a house with no toolbox, that chair is now a purchase. It is a decision and a trip and money the family does not have, and one fewer chair at supper until the money exists. In a house with a toolbox, that chair is an evening. Picture him. He is on the floor of the kitchen after supper, on one knee, the chair upside down between his hands. He has been out of work for 4 months. He looked for work this morning, and he will look again tomorrow, and he has stopped talking about it at the table because his wife has stopped asking. He is not a proud man just now. Pride requires something to stand on. But he can fix the chair. He glues the rung. He drives 2 screws through the seat from underneath where nobody will ever see them. He turns it upright and sets it down and puts his weight on it, and it holds, and it will hold for another 40 years, and one of his grandchildren will inherit it and never know. That is what the toolbox gave a man in 1934. Not savings. Not convenience. It gave him something he could still do for his family on a day when the world had told him there was nothing he could do at all. Do not underestimate that. Some men held on to themselves through those years by fixing things that did not entirely need fixing, in the evening, quietly, while the children did their lessons. 11. The button tin. Every American house had one, and everyone listening knows exactly what it looked like. A coffee can. A cocoa tin. A cigar box. It rattled in a way no other object in the house rattled, and when a mother set it on the table and pried the lid off, a child would stop whatever they were doing and come look, because a button tin is the closest thing a poor house had to treasure. Brass buttons off a coat nobody remembered. Little pearl ones from a christening gown. A military button. For matching black ones still threaded together on a scrap of the shirt they came from. A single glass button, blue, that had no partner in the world and would never have one. Every button in that tin was harvested. Before a garment went to rags, the buttons came off. Always. That was not a suggestion, it was law, and a woman who sent a shirt to the rag bag with its buttons on would have felt she had thrown money in the stove. Watch her use it. A boy's shirt has lost a button, and the shirt is otherwise perfectly good, and tomorrow is a school day. She opens the tin. She sorts with 2 fingers, tipping the tin toward the lamp. She finds one that is close, not identical, close, and she sews it on with maybe 4 inches of thread, and it takes her 6 minutes, and the shirt is a shirt again. 6 minutes. Nothing left the house. No coat was put on. No store was entered. No money moved. A problem appeared at 7 in the evening and was solved by 7:06, using a container of things other people would have thrown away, and the boy went to school the next day looking exactly like the other boys, which was the entire point and the only point that mattered. That tin was not sentimentality. Old ladies were not keeping buttons because buttons are pretty. That tin was the smallest, cheapest, most efficient insurance policy in the history of the American home, and its premium was the 2 seconds it took to snip a button off a dying shirt. Somebody in your family had one. It is possible you still have it, in a closet, and have not opened it since. Open it. 12. The needle, the thread, and the art of darning. The tin was nothing without the hand. A needle. A spool. A thimble worn shiny. And in a good many houses, a smooth wooden egg, a darning egg, that slipped inside a sock and stretched the hole open so it could be woven shut. Woven. Not patched over. A darn done properly is not a patch, it is new cloth, made stitch by stitch across an absence, and a woman who could darn well produced a heel you could not find with your thumb. That skill took years to acquire and about 1 generation to lose. Understand the arithmetic. A pair of wool socks was a real expense. A hole in the heel is a Tuesday. If a hole in the heel ends a pair of socks, then a family of 6 is buying socks constantly and forever, and the money for that comes out of the food. So the socks did not end. They were darned and darned again over the darn, and worn until the sock was more repair than sock, and then only then, they went into the rag bag, and we will get to the rag bag. This was after supper work. The lamp is lit. The radio is low. The mother's hands are moving and she is not looking at them, she is looking at her children, and she is talking to them, and the work is happening anyway because her hands learned it when she was 9 years old at her own mother's elbow. Half of American childhood memory is the sound of that, a low voice, and the small tug of thread being pulled through cloth. 13. The rag bag. Hung on a nail in the pantry, or in a pillowcase behind the door, and it swallowed everything. Every shirt, sheet, dress, and towel that finally died went into that bag, and it went in already sorted by a woman's eye. Good cotton here. Wool here. Flannel here. Nothing in that bag was garbage. That bag was a fabric store with no cash register. Out of it came patches for the knees of trousers. Squares for a quilt that would take 3 winters to finish. Bandages boiled. Dish rags. Cleaning cloths, an endless supply, which is why nobody in 1935 ever bought a paper towel and would not have understood the concept. Stuffing for a cushion. Braided strips for a rug. Cloth to wrap the apples in the cellar. Cloth to wrap the pie for a neighbor. A doll, sometimes at Christmas, made out of the sleeves of a dress the mother had worn as a bride. Think about a house where a worn-out sheet is a raw material rather than a trash bag problem. Now think about the mind that had to run it. Because none of this worked unless someone in the house knew, at any hour, what was in that bag. Not roughly. Exactly. She knew there was enough gray wool for the elbows. She knew the blue flannel was down to 2 pieces and had already decided what they were for. She was running an inventory system in her head, for free, for 40 years, and she never once called it that. She just knew her house. 14. Wire, string, and rope. Coiled on a nail. Wound into a ball. Kept in a drawer, in a jar, in a box beside the door. Baling wire. Picture wire. A hank of clothesline. Butcher's twine off a package. String from the parcel that came at Christmas, wound onto a card and saved. Always, always saved. And modern people laugh at this one. It has become a joke about old folks, the ball of string, the drawer of wire that fits nothing. Here is why it is not funny. Wire and string are not objects. They are potential. They have no fixed purpose, which means they have every purpose. They are the substance the house used to answer a question that had not been asked yet. A gate sags. A handle breaks off a bucket. The clothesline snaps in a wind. The stovepipe needs a brace. A crate needs to be tied. A tomato plant needs to stand up. A dog needs a lead. A parcel needs to be sent. A curtain needs to be hung by tomorrow morning because company is coming. Every one of those is a small emergency, and every one of them was solved in 10 minutes by a man reaching into a drawer, and none of them cost anything, and none of them required leaving the property. That is what the drawer was. It was the house's ability to improvise. Your father had that drawer. You probably cleaned it out after he was gone and could not understand why he kept any of it, and stood there for a moment with a coil of wire in your hand, feeling something you could not name. He kept it because he grew up in a house where the answer to a broken thing had to already be inside the house. That is the third group. Toolbox, buttons, needle, rags, wire. 5 ways of saying one sentence. This family repairs what it owns, and it repairs it tonight, and it repairs it here. Not because they were noble. Because replacement was not guaranteed. Because a thing that broke and could not be fixed was a thing that was simply gone, possibly for years and possibly for good. Repair was not a virtue in that house. Repair was arithmetic. But a house also has to defend itself. From cold, from damp, from dirt, from the slow grinding of ordinary use. And those defenses were made of cloth, mostly, and weighed more than you would expect. 15. The heavy quilts. Not decoration. Not folded at the foot of the bed to look nice in a photograph. Wait. They were made from the rag bag over years, and they were mended where they wore thin, and they were heavy enough that a small child pinned under one could barely turn over, and every American of a certain age remembers that weight and remembers it as safety. Because bedrooms in that house were cold. Genuinely, seriously cold. The stove was in the kitchen, and heat does not travel down a hallway out of kindness. In January, in an upstairs room, a glass of water beside the bed could grow a skin of ice. The family did not heat the bedroom. That would cost fuel, and fuel had to reach March. So they heated the person. Quilts on top. Sometimes a heated stone or a hot brick wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed. Children slept 2 and 3 to a bed, and that was not only poverty. It was warmth, and some of them will tell you now that they have never in 80 years slept as well as they slept then, in a freezing room, under 6 pounds of their grandmother's dresses. They did not warm the house. They warmed what mattered and let the rest of the house be cold. 16. The heavy curtains. The windows in those houses were terrible. Single panes, loose in the frame, whistling. So when the sun went down, the curtains came down too, thick ones, lined ones, whatever heavy cloth the house possessed, and every night, in every room, somebody closed them. And in the morning, on the south side of the house, somebody opened them wide to let the winter sun in, and closed them again the moment it swung away. That was a job. A daily job, usually a child's job, performed twice a day for a lifetime. Nobody in that family could have explained a word of the physics. They simply knew, the way you know your own street, that an open window at night stole the fire out of the stove, and that fuel was money, and that money was the reason the father came home the way he did. A child pulling a curtain closed at dusk was saving the family maybe a few cents. That child grew up to be a man who turned off lights in empty rooms and drove his own children slightly crazy doing it. Now you know why. 17. The rag rugs and the floor cloths. Braided, hooked, sewn out of the same bag as the quilts. Laid across doorways where the draft came under. Laid beside the beds so bare feet did not meet a frozen board at 5 in the morning. They were made from clothing the family had actually worn, which means that a woman walking across her own kitchen was walking across the shirt her husband wore when they married and the dress her daughter outgrew in 1931. Nobody said that out loud. But she knew. She had cut the strips herself. And by the back door there were cloths for mud and boots, because dirt was the enemy of cloth and cloth could not be replaced, and everything in that house was connected to everything else in a chain that no one had designed and everyone understood. 18. The buckets, the basins, and the last of the soap. Under the sink and hanging on the wall, galvanized buckets. Enamel basins. A washtub. Water in that house did not come from wherever you happened to be standing. It came from a place, and it went to a place, and everything in between was carried. So the basin on the kitchen table was a sink. The bucket was the plumbing. The washtub was the laundry, and on Saturday night the washtub was the bathtub, in front of the stove, filled by hand, one kettle at a time, and used by the whole family in sequence. And everybody who lived it remembers exactly what number in the sequence they were. And beside that basin, always, a small jar or a wire cage holding the ends of soap. Slivers too thin to hold. Too small to use. Never, not once, thrown out. They were collected and dropped in water to soften and pressed together into a new lump, or shaken in a wire basket through the dishwater until they were gone. Not a fragment of soap ever left that house except as suds. Ask yourself why a woman with 100 harder problems would bother to save something worth a fraction of a penny. She was not saving the penny. She was practicing something. She was proving to herself and to the children watching her do it that in this house nothing useful is ever abandoned. It was a small daily ceremony of refusal, performed at the sink, and every child in that kitchen absorbed it without a single word being spoken. Some of you save soap ends right now. You have never known why. Now you do. Somebody taught you, and they did it by hand, and they never mentioned it. Which brings us to the last two, and these are not tools at all. 19. The radio. It sat in the front room, and it was very likely the most expensive object the family owned, and a great many families bought one in the worst years of their lives, on time, when they could not afford it. Historians have found that strange for 90 years. It is not strange. That family had lost the shape of things. The father's work was gone or shaky. The money was uncertain. The country was in trouble in a way nobody could see the edges of. The radio told them what day it was. It told them the weather, and the prices, and the news, and it played music into a room where nobody had money to go anywhere. It brought a voice into a farmhouse 11 miles from another human being. And here is what it really did. It ended the loneliness of thinking you were the only one. A family in a cold front room could hear a voice speaking to the whole country, and no, not intellectually, but in the chest, that their situation was not a private failure. That the neighbors were struggling too. That across 1,000 miles, other people were sitting in other cold rooms listening to the same words at the same moment. Shame is the most expensive thing a poor family carries, and the radio, quietly, took some of it away. Turn it down low. Put a family around the kitchen table on a Thursday night, peeling and shelling and mending, hands moving, the voice murmuring from the other room. They are not consuming entertainment. They are working, together, in company. 20. The table. Wood. Scarred. Too big for the room. And it was not a place where a family ate dinner. It was the place where the family ate dinner, did homework, cut patterns, shelled peas, wrote letters, rolled dough, played cards, laid out a sick child, argued, and after the children went up, opened the envelope with the bills in it. Everything in this entire list eventually arrived at that table. The buttons were sorted on it. The socks were darned at it. The lamp stood on it. The bread came out of the stove and cooled on it. The radio was heard from it. And the arithmetic, the terrible arithmetic, done twice, done 3 times, done with a pencil that stopped moving for a while, was done on it after everyone else had gone to bed. 2 people sat at that table late at night more often than their children ever knew. They spoke quietly. They decided which bill would wait. They decided that the shoes could last until spring. They decided not to say anything at breakfast, and they did not, and the children grew up thinking those years had been fine. That is the 20th object. It is not a survival tool. It is the room where survival was decided, by adults who protected their children from the knowledge of how close it sometimes was. Everything on that shelf, in that drawer, in that tin, in that cellar, every one of those 20 things came out of a conversation at that table. That is why, when a house was finally sold and the furniture divided, somebody in the family always wanted the table. They could not have told you why either. 20 objects. Lay them out on that table and look at them together, one last time. A lamp. A tin of matches. A stove that burned what you could see. A cellar. A pantry shelf you could count in days. Jars. Flour sacks. A tin of fat. A wall of glass in the dark. A toolbox. A tin of buttons. A needle. A rag bag. A drawer of wire and string. Quilts heavy as guilt. Curtains. Rugs. Buckets, basins, and slivers of soap. A radio. And a table with a scar down the middle. Not one of them is remarkable. You could carry the whole system out of that house in the back of a truck, and nobody watching would think they had seen anything at all. They would think they had seen a poor family's junk. And they would be right about the poor. Let us not pretend otherwise, not at the end. That family was tired. There were winters they did not want to remember and did not talk about. There was hunger in that decade, real hunger, and there was fear, and there was shame, and there were families whose objects and skill and patience were not enough, because sometimes nothing is enough. Nobody should want to go back there. Nobody who was actually there ever did. But something was true in that house that has quietly stopped being true. When something went wrong, and something always went wrong, the answer was already inside the building. The lights failed and the lamp was on the shelf. The shirt lost a button and the tin was in the drawer. The chair broke and a man got down on one knee. The cold came and the quilt was already made, out of clothes they had already worn, by hands that were still in the room. That house did not have more than yours. It had less of nearly everything. What it had was a set of answers that did not have to be ordered, delivered, downloaded, scheduled, or paid for. The house could take care of itself for a while. Not forever, but long enough for the family to find their feet. And the modern house? The modern house is better in almost every measurable way. It is warmer. It is cleaner. It is safer. The food is more plentiful than any generation before us has ever seen, and I will not stand here and pretend that was not worth having. But somewhere along the way, one habit at a time, so gradually that no one could have pointed to the year it happened, the answers moved out of the house. They live somewhere else now. In a store. In an app. In a truck coming across town. In a technician's schedule, 3 days out. And on the ordinary evening when the power goes and the card reader is dark and the flashlight batteries have gone green, the house is still full of things, and none of them are answers. That is not a moral failing. Nobody chose it. You were not asked. But it is a loss, and you have felt it, and that is probably why you are still here. Because here is what I think this list has really been about. Somewhere in your memory, there is a woman who saved buttons in a coffee can and a man who kept a drawer of wire that fit nothing he owned. And for most of your life, those things looked like harmless eccentricity. Old people keeping old junk. They were not keeping junk. They were keeping the ability to solve a problem without asking anyone for help. They had learned, in a decade you did not have to live through, that help is not always coming, and that a family that can only be rescued is a family that is waiting. They were not hoarders. They were not cheap. They were not stuck in the past. They were the last generation of Americans whose homes could defend them, and they carried those habits forward into the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, into kitchens with new appliances, saving jars they no longer needed. Turning off lights in empty rooms, sewing on buttons that could have been replaced, trying, without ever explaining it, to hand you something they did not have the words for. You have the words now. They were poor. They were not helpless. So here is what I would ask of you tonight, and it is not much. Go find one drawer in your house. The messy one. The one with the string and the screws and the keys that open nothing. Do not clean it out. Add something to it. And if this brought back a face, a kitchen, a smell of a cellar, a tin that rattled, subscribe to the Depression-era home. Give this video a like so it finds someone else who remembers, and tell us in the comments what your mother, your father, or your grandmother kept in that drawer. What did they save that you never understood until now? Who in your family could fix anything? And what is the one object from that old house you would give almost anything to hold again? Share this with someone who grew up in that house with you. They may be the only other person alive who remembers where the button tin was kept. Those hands are gone. The habits do not have to be.